Hi everyone, welcome to Quick Connect Live. It's a series of live conversations that we have as part of collaboration between the Strengths Finders Singapore Network with my two very good friends here, Ethan and Jeffeth. So today we're going to talk about this wonderful topic called shadow self, right? And how it happened was that the two of them were just having their own internal conversation. And I was just at the side, it's like, what are they talking about? So I said, hey, why don't we just discuss and talk a little bit about more about it during the Quick Connect live sessions, and here we are. So, Ethan, I'm just going to hand it over to you today.
Well, why don't you just do a round of introductions for everybody? That first, at least be a host.
Okay, I thought I can shake leg today. Okay, so no problem. So what we can do is let's just go around, do a quick introduction, just your name, and what you do. Enough, right?
Yeah.
I don't have enough knowledge about shadow self to ask a question related to shadow self.
Basically, yeah.
Okay, so just your name and kind of what you do. So we will begin with, say, Irene, and then Irene, you'll pick the next one, so and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So my name is Irene. I'm a full-time coach and facilitator. So I'll just go over to Faith.
Faith, I do internet product management. Irene?
Oh, you called me, right? Hi everyone, I'm Paylin. I'm a corporate trainer, full-time corporate trainer in the area of personal branding. And maybe next to go, Jeffeth.
I am Jeffeth. I'm a learning designer in the public service. Next to go, Joanna.
Hello, I'm Joanna. I'm doing user experience research, but on Thursday, I'll be rotating to another role. So I'll be doing learning and development.
Oh, okay. Lots of L&D. Yeah. Pick the next person.
Next one, Justin.
Hi, I'm Justin. I'm currently running school enrichment training programs for leadership and entrepreneurship.
Cool. Awesome. Pick the next person, Justin.
Who's it going? Is that Ethan?
Ethan will go last.
I'll introduce myself later.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Let's go to ET.
By the way, for the rest of you, do turn on your videos. So that's kind of what we do, right? So that we can connect with each other.
Yep.
Okay. Hi. My name is Irene. ET is a short form.
Cool.
So I work in quality in a pharmaceutical company.
Cool. Is it one of those who does the vaccine?
Not yet.
Okay. Thanks, Eileen. Pick the next person.
Lillian.
Sorry, I froze.
Hey, hi. Lillian, you're next.
Hi, my name is Lillian. I'm a youth worker intern.
Youth worker intern, cool.
Share. Would you like to share? Oh, oops.
Good morning, everyone. This is Cher. I will turn my video on hopefully later. I'm not able to yet. I am in leadership development and coaching and some facilitation.
Cool. Awesome. So we got youth workers, L&D, kind of user experience, yes, a little bit, and quite a good representation today. So Ethan, over to you. We can introduce yourself.
Have you introduced yourself properly, Alex?
No, everybody knows me, right? So my name is Alex. My name is Alex. I work in real estate. I do workplace experience. So there's a little bit of relation to user experience. So I do a little bit of design thinking and human-centered design on the side. So I do training, coaching, and facilitation. I do Clifton Strengths, Soundwave, Strong Interest Inventory, among other profiling tools. So kind of a profiling tool junkie. And I do Lego Serious Play as well, which is really, really fun for workshops. Okay, so yes. Just quick introduction. Ethan, cool.
Yeah, okay.
Finally, now I can really pass the ball to you. You kind of threw it back to me 3 times.
Yes, I have to throw it back to you every single time because that's your role. I don't know. But okay, I think, hi, I'm Ethan. So what you see here is The Office Matters. It's actually a project that I've been developing now on the down low, because previously I was making this the main theme, but I learned a lot of things that changed. So I'm right now running a cybersecurity school. It's a little bit different. But what happens is that I'm very focused on getting people to work well, do well, as well as to be able to focus on the things that matter. Because a lot of times people don't recognize that a lot of things they care about are the things that don't really matter. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have experienced this at workplaces where there'll be somebody in the office that will always pick on the things that you don't want to pick, you don't want to talk about. And that is not much use for the final product, or has not much use for whatever we're going to deal with next. And that's actually kind of one of the starting points I wanted to start with, to talk about why is it important to understand the shadow self. Because if you understand the term shadow, how many of you have come across the term shadow self before? Never faced? Nope. Paylin?
I have. But I can't quite remember. I think it's about parts of ourselves that we know is there, but we don't quite like that part of ourselves, and we suppress that, either consciously or subconsciously.
Very cool. Jeffeth? Yeah.
Yeah, similar to what Pei-Ling mentioned, right? So there are parts of ourselves that got either repressed or dissociated, maybe through some traumatic experience from young. And then because we dissociate it and repress it, we project it onto someone else without even recognizing it.
Yeah.
So that essentially affects our well-being, right? Without us knowing it.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just stop here for a moment. We can talk more later.
We definitely can follow up on that. Joanna, have you heard of shadow self before? Okay. Justin? Nope. E.T.? Eileen? Nope. Lillian? Have you heard of shadow self before today?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay,
Like the iceberg thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. Share yourself.
I have not in a formal sense, no.
Cool. All right. So one of the biggest things about shadow self is it's a very, very big topic on its own, only because as the word shadow comes along, most people are not aware of it. My simplest way of describing shadow self. So, have you ever felt irritated at somebody or something that you find it irrational for you to feel irritated towards? Okay, that's usually because you have it yourself, you're repressing it, and you are not seeing it for yourself. So whenever I'm irritated, stressed out, unhappy, angry, these are all signs that something within myself is speaking up. I might not like it myself. So when I go back to this, right, let me go back to why I'm so interested in this topic. So one of the biggest struggles I had as a medical student was to see patients as different from doctors, as if patients are not humans and doctors are humans. For example, the way we dehumanize patients, this is not a thing that is bad per se. It was a coping mechanism for a lot of people, because once you separate yourself from the patients, you don't have to deal with them as humans and not feel so attached. One of the things we're taught is to detach ourselves from the other people that we deal with. The reasoning is because if not, that's when a lot of our emotions would come up and we lose what we term as objectivity. By the way, once you understand shadow self, you start realizing objectivity never exists. But that's a longer story. Right? People are never objective. There is an objective truth and reality and facts, and then there is our perception of it. Our perception is based off a mixture between our ego, our animus, our shadow self, as well as our actual persona. So these are four different things that Jung talks about. Jung comes from the line of the psychologists and psychiatrists in the early eras. So he was a direct disciple of Sigmund Freud, so known as the father of psychology, right? Sigmund Freud had a very different concept. It's called the id, the ego, and the superego. Have you heard of that? Right? So that is the general understanding in psychology that people typically know. Most of the studies around Jung don't really go into that. So one of the major things about this is that the shadow self is equivalent to the id in Freudian concepts. So if you understand where it comes from, the idea of id is the unconscious self. It is the part of us that is not conscious and aware and out there and dealing with things. If you look at the way our brain works, right? Everybody knows the difference between the unconscious and conscious mind. Anybody knows what's the difference? All right, somebody wants to share? Anybody wants to try? Is this all first step expressiveness? Right, Jeffeth?
No one understands that unless they have taken emergenetics.
I know, but that's why we had an emergenetics session before. You can go check it out. Okay, one of the major things about conscious versus unconscious is conscious is what you think you can remember. It's related back to your ego. It's related back to what you are aware of. So how many of you have noticed this, right? When there's a construction next door, after a while, you forget about the construction. So that is where your consciousness has tuned out. It becomes part of your unconscious. It's like our parents nagging becomes unconscious to us. We just go, yeah, right? So there's very little conscious efforts in that. Consciousness always relates to the ego in Freudian terms, or in this, for Jungian terms, it is about the self. It is the animus and the self-image that we are related to. So when we talk about this is, whenever we're conscious, we start looking at things in using a way of interpreting information in very deliberate, detail-oriented fashions. So language requires us to be conscious to understand fully. So for example, as you're listening to me now, as I'm throwing you this complex stuff, your consciousness needs to break down what I'm saying in order for you to understand. However, if you watch Korean dramas where everybody's crying, your unconscious is very happy. It'll just start, yeah, I see that, I can recognize this, okay. But whenever we use language on its own, and especially with complex concepts like this, the conscious is very much activated. And it requires a certain amount of willpower and energy to be able to do this. There's a reason why a lot of us fall asleep during lectures. Because it requires a lot of conscious input, a lot of effort for us to interpret the information to be relevant and usable for us. So in order for us to counteract that as speakers or as trainers, very often we need to be animated and loud and boisterous or different ways to try to engage people's unconscious so that their consciousness would be okay working on the things that we're trying to get them to understand. So that's how we actually kind of separate. Unconsciousness, if you think about it, relates back to emotions, relates back to energy levels, relates back to all the different things that we unconsciously do. Most of you probably wake up in the morning, first thing you do, walk in the toilet, start brushing your teeth. How many of you do it consciously? Most people don't, right? You don't go, I'm making this choice. Unconscious behaviors are also what we term as heuristics or tendencies. So when we go back to shadow self, there is this part of us that we don't like and we choose to block it out. So there's the automatic reactions that we have and the ones that we don't like to see ourselves do. So have you ever been in an argument? So my favorite way of starting, well, I've already started, but one of my favorite ways of talking about this is, have you ever had an experience where you were arguing with somebody and you forgot what you argued about 2 seconds later? That's because your shadow self came out. Our conscious mind does not want to see the shadow self. Let's talk about this on this level. So have you ever had somebody trigger you? And I use the word trigger, meaning they say something, they do something, you don't know why it feels so, but you just feel really, really angry at the person. That's called a shadow self acting up. And then you turn it into a different person to manage the situation. You're not conscious anymore. You're dealing with the person in a completely different manner. There's a term for this in psychiatry, also known as splitting, where you turn into a different person. So the shadow selves, actually, there's multiple parts of shards or fragments of us, will come out and deal with the situation where we're completely unconscious. We cannot remember this once we're lucid again. We are not aware of what we did. We cannot control ourselves. And this is actually also what creates things like addictions, arguments, and all these kind of different things. So one of the funny parts about this is shadow selves remains as shadow as long as we judge it. So for every single person that you judge for not being good looking enough, for not being charismatic enough, for not being nice enough, for not being whatever enough, there's probably a part of you that you reject that is that too. And that is a part of your shadow self. So this is why shadow self is a very interesting topic for me, because a lot of us do things that other people do, but we don't see it. And that's where our shadow selves are at. So this is when reflections and friendships and people who are real friends would really be able to give feedback to you in a very loving manner for you to observe your so-called shadow self. Most of us can never see it if we don't have the right support. So let me ask you this question first up. How many of you feel like you have a place in your life where you can be yourself 100% without worrying about whether people will judge you? Start with Alex. You're still muted.
I was busy kind of trying to map it on mural to no avail. I'll show you later. Really, it's like, I do have some space where I pretty much feel that I can speak without being judged. But usually those are in, how do I put it? Usually that's one-to-one and with very, very, very close friends.
Very cool. Not with me and Jefford.
Both of you also.
Great. Okay. I'm not pressuring you. It's okay. Great.
I'm comfortable with both of you enough to share certain things. Just that in some cases, some things require length of relationship because they kind of see me evolve over the years.
So the context, the need to understand the context.
Right. So when they actually see it, they understand it. Between the both of us, we talk about it, but you may not see it happening.
Yeah, I understand. Like, so the context matters for you to share, so that you try to share as much.
The context also because when you see it, you kind of understand it because you experience it, right?
Yeah.
And I guess some of them are actually people who suffered under my shadow self, so to speak. Right?
Your younger self, which might have the shadow self.
Yeah. So I mean, we had those conflicts, and then there's also that point of reconciliation, of that understanding and that sharing, which allows, I guess, in some ways, that acceptance, right? I like when you talked about how shadow self tends to exist because we judge it, right? And sometimes it's not just us judging it, but when someone else comes in and look at it and says it's okay, that also helps us to accept and let it go, right? So that's I think Dr. Henry Cloud likes to say, right? There's the community of support that allows us to grow out of it. So that's why.
So actually in that breath, right? Like, because all my work, if you realize Dakota, The Office Matters, all these kind of different things, is to talk about things that are otherwise unspeakable on a level that is okay, so that we can bring our shadow selves out and put it to light, right? Like that's how I usually look at it. So I can use multiple languages around this because we're talking about shadow self today. I'm going to speak like this. So we're going to be focusing on the fact that shadow requires light to dissipate, right? It requires you to view it in light and illuminate it. So like Alex said, right? They suffer with your shadow self, so they understand what the growth that you have gone through. And therefore, when you share certain information, it's a little easier for you to share with them. So you can let out the shadow self a bit more out for them to observe it and illuminate it a little bit more. Is that the case?
Yep.
I think a lot of times when we talk about good relationships and love, I actually view it as the space where the shadow self can live. By the way, just as a interesting note, right? Like, if a person truly loves you, and I say this without the Chinese upbringing version of love, you know, you will listen to me, you will must obey what I say, you must No. When we talk about the objective definition of love, is acceptance and appreciation regardless. And this is actually what I learned from psychiatry. The best psychiatrists and psychotherapists are the ones who can love straight off the bat, which means they have no judgments for your actions and your thought processes. And if you have any judgments or negative impressions of the other person, it will come through in the session through your shadow self. And so today, I also want to share a bit more about how we can observe it, how we can understand it. But I think going a bit further into this, I think I want anybody else who wants to chime in on a little bit about, do you have a safe space to be 100% yourself? That you can share anything. Anybody else has... I can of course put Jefford because he's the other person who's supposed to host this, but I can put other people, anybody who would like to share a bit more. We can ask our regular Paylin.
Oh, thankfully you consider me as regular.
You are.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not very sure of my status.
When we were discussing some of the stuff, right, we were straight out, like, we just having a session the other day. We're talking about the Quick Connect, right? We're like, we have regulars like Paylin.
and I was around. I was
No, we were just internal. It was just the three of us. So we were just like even internally, we remember you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Faith is also one of our regulars.
Yes,
actually, Eileen
yes.
as well. And then Joanna actually has come for a few rounds already. The rest are mostly new. And Cher is definitely one of our favorite regulars also, because she wakes up early in the morning to come join us.
Oh, yes.
Hey, Ethan, we also have Irene with us. She joined us a bit late, so she didn't have the opportunity to introduce herself. So maybe Irene, you can just pop in and just introduce what you do. Say hi. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Alex. Hey, sorry, guys. I was late. It's the first time. You want the first time I joined. So yeah, very quick one. One of the strength coaches. Happy to be here just to check out what is this shadow self thing. I thought you were going to talk about Enneagram, but then it's definitely related to how you put it. Yeah, so happy to learn more.
Yeah, thanks, Irene.
Okay. Hey, Irene, I thought it's very interesting that you mentioned Enneagram. Is there a reference to shadow self in Enneagram?
Enneagram is very much into shadow self because that is the box with which each type is being trapped in the most. And that's where we identify a person's type, which they need to develop and grow out of it.
Yeah, so Irene, just to address that, right? Like, because the origins of Enneagram did not talk about the shadow self, it was added on later on because they were using Jungian concepts. But shadow self is a great way of describing the same thing that Enneagram talks about. So I agree with you. In fact, like my type 7. So we talked about Enneagram last round when we did a shootout between strengths and Enneagram. My type 7 is a very classic, like the FOMO, fear of missing out, opportunistic, always jumping at things because I fear not being involved. And if you look at the psyche, right, because I judge myself for not being involved when I was younger, it spills over to the future. And what happens is that my shadow self became the person who would constantly jump at every opportunity, even if it was irrational. And I think this is very much in line with what you were just sharing.
Interesting. How are you now with regard to that?
Very good. It took a lot of years to manage it. I started my self-healing journey since 17, and I started really learning about shadow self and all this kind of things since I was 17. So it works in my favor because I've been at this for 16 years. I've gone through multiple rounds of different types of therapy, gone through multiple parts of spiritual healing. I learned all the different personality tests as Alex and the psychometric tools as Alex and Jeffeth and I would like to talk a lot about. And then all these different things that we like to work on are really building around how do you identify more about yourself, right? Because the more we can identify what is us and love that part of us, the more we can make conscious decisions along the way.
Absolutely. Very nice.
Yes. Yeah, but we'll go back to Palin and talk about safe space. Thank you, Irene.
I think for me, the safe space, I would say with my husband and one or two very close friends. Yeah, generally it takes time for the relationship to progress to a stage where you feel you can talk about anything and everything and not feel judged by the other person. Yeah, so there's a lot of testing in the relationship to see how the person is. And of course, hopefully I can also likewise be non-judgmental towards them as well. I think it has to be reciprocal.
Very cool. Anybody else who wants to share their thoughts? Can I just shoot Jeff first?
Yeah, so when I first came across shadow selves because I want to work on myself, right? And I didn't know that because for those who have worked with me before will know me as come across as quite calm and peacekeeping in my nature or preference. So I didn't know because like there was one particular colleague which I often feel that she's a very angry person, right? So I tend to judge her a lot at work until I realized that one day because I realized that I make that negative judgment that it's wrong to feel angry. And therefore you are the angry person. And I never knew that until later on somebody told me that, hey, actually it's okay to feel angry, you know. And to me that was an insight, you know. I didn't know I didn't know it's okay for me to just feel angry. I always thought I had to put up a front where I look okay, even though I'm not okay inside. I don't know how many people have similar kind of feelings before, but But that was an epiphany for me lah. That if I'm really angry at that moment, I can show it, I can express it, but not onto other people, but just acknowledge that the feeling is present. But going back to Ethan's question of do I have a safe space? Yes, with my wife. But I must say it didn't, even when we were married a long time ago, right? I always portrayed that same peacekeeping nature, very calm. So she perceived me as somebody who's doesn't seem to have any problems. But it's sometimes like the external world looks okay, but internally you're like kind of crazy inside lah. Yeah. So so that when I start to recognize that, oh, I'm actually projecting that it's okay that I don't have the anger. Everybody else is angry, but it's not me.
Yes.
But until I realize that I'm the angry person, and once I come to terms that, hey, actually I'm really angry and I can feel it and I have the safe space to feel it, it's normal to feel it. That's where I start to feel that the shadow sort of got acknowledged in that sense lah. I don't know whether there's a term for that. Yeah.
It's called illuminated. I use the word illumination, but a lot of people, there's a lot of different terms to develop this idea, but it's just one of those things which is like a little bit hard to cover because it talks about healing. It talks about accepting it. The shadow self will integrate into the other parts of you. Ideally, right? That's what we ideally hope. Of course, there are certain parts of our lives. Okay, so I want to go through a little bit more later on, but just anybody else has anything to add, your own personal experience, any safe space within your life before I move forward? And like, because this question is, do you have a safe space where you can share anything about yourself? Everything, even the worst side of yourself. Like, for example, where I feel safe enough to be able to say, like, I just wanted to punch this person's face because just cannot stand the face. You know, something like this where the person won't judge you at all for wanting violence or even having the feelings. Anybody has like anything to share? No. Okay, so then we just ask this question. Do you have a safe space?
I think Irene has this unmuted.
Irene? Okay, great. Yeah, sorry. Great, sorry, I didn't see that. Thank you. Thank you,
I think the answer for me is not a person. The answer for me is age.
Age? Okay, cool. Meaning you've gotten to an age to...
Yeah, the older I get, I think the less I care about how,
people think
perceived.
Of you. Yes. Yeah. So even better, right? Like, let me add on this, right? So we're previously when Alex was joining also for my Dakota sessions, and I was sharing with people about this. There are people who will feel unsafe no matter how safe the space is. That they are so scared of their shadow self that once there's a chance of it coming out, they will make the safe space unsafe for themselves. Right? If you notice, there are people who, when you want to address something with them, and you're trying to be as nice as possible and you're not judging them, but you see them spiraling and judging themselves the whole time, that's also part of the shadow self issue. It's part of the reason why people don't want to see. Yeah.
But isn't that a lot also about a person's belief about the world?
Yes.
So I've known of people who, we don't see that very often nowadays, like being sold off as a kid. Right. So because they've been sold off, then their model of the world is that the world is generally an unsafe place. People don't really care about you. They're all out to take advantage of you if they can. And therefore, anything that is good, is seen as a bait for taking advantage of you down the line. So it becomes a self-reinforcing belief system of how they respond to the world. So do you consider that shadow self?
It is considered shadow self. It's because you don't want to see yourself believing this thing, but you believe it. So, okay, so if I don't know that I believe that the world is an unsafe place, so recognizing the split difference between believing the world is unsafe versus believing that the world is unsafe is me observing myself, recognizing that I believe that the world is unsafe. That means whether or not the world is safe or not, I will still believe the world is unsafe because I believe so. Is an admittance, is a recognition of my shadow self. To say that the world is always unsafe is a belief and sitting into the shadow self and using it as a tool and weapon to whack things. And then we go back to Lillian's question, right? That's how people sabotage themselves. When you believe people are against you, even if they're not, you will keep on hurting yourself and self-sabotaging because you believe that they hurt you, they will hurt you, and they will scam you. I'm dealing with a bunch of people, right, that regularly who believe that the world will screw them over all the time. No matter how nice you are to them, no matter how much good things you give them, they believe that you will screw them over, and they will create this very scenarios that will get you to screw them over because they created it, make it untenable for you to stay around them anymore. And then they start blaming you for it. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you have experienced people like this, right? Where they will say, people don't love me, people don't appreciate me. Then you try to help them, try to take care of them, try to show them otherwise. And then at the end of it, they make it completely impossible for you to be around them. And then they'll blame you for not believing in them. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have experienced this. This happens to a lot of us because there are a lot of people out there who are like this because of their shadow self. And I don't blame them for it. It's what their upbringing has brought them to believe. So like Alex, what you said, right? The person who was sold away will believe that they're unlovable. So when you show them love, they don't believe it's true. They will do whatever it takes to push you away.
If you go back to attachment theory, that would be the chaotic attachment theory.
Precisely. That's the chaotic attachment style based on the multiple shadow selves that will appear in dealing with the concept of all this. Another way I would love to describe shadow self is this word called not allowed. This term called not allowed. I'm not allowed to be angry, Jeffers, right? I'm not allowed to be happy. A lot of people you probably know, once they're in a happy place, they will do something to screw themselves up. And then I'm not allowed to be successful. I'm not allowed to fail. I'm not allowed to this.
So Ethan, I just want to add on to one point that you mentioned, right? So like this, I'm not allowed to be angry, right? And I noticed the same projection appears when I am handling my own kids. Like because that belief is so strong, and I thought I'm somebody who's not angry all the time, but actually I'm very angry. That when my kids sometimes did something wrong and they cry, I'll ask them not to cry. You're not allowed to be angry about it. And when they get angry, I'll get even more angry. Then there's this cyclic loop so I didn't realize until one day, my wife suddenly pointed out to me, and I thought, oh, that's very interesting. Like I didn't know that I'm actually projecting on them, and I'm unconscious of it. I thought I knew what I was doing until when the thing happened and I reflect on it. It's like, oh, that's a very funny pattern that pops up.
So your belief that you shouldn't be angry, which is not allowed, stops you from seeing your anger, and therefore you impose the do not be angry, not allowed to be angry to your child, your kids. Then, but meanwhile, whereas you're projecting onto them, you're showing the anger.
Yes.
And then the kid becomes more confused because you're showing them the very thing that you told them not to do.
Yes. So I get into that kind of dilemma, right? Because like, that wasn't what I intended, but somehow it projected onto them.
Yeah. So having children is interestingly, like my brother was watching so many videos on psychology because I have a new niece so since April. So like I was watching my brother watch all these videos that I usually watch. I'm like, because it's a very interesting journey that he has to take because he now has a kid, right? He now has somebody that he's worried about projecting himself on. I think that's actually one of the interesting things that comes along. I mean, of course, that doesn't mean you have to have a kid. You just have to be aware. Lillian, you did unmute just now. Just wondering if you wanted to share some things.
Yeah, like I think I have two questions. So like I think adding on to Alex. So is it like in summary, like your trauma or past traumas can actually contribute to like your shadow self?
Absolutely. Your traumas are the basis behind your shadow self.
So in a sense, like how I put it, because like it's a very sorry, I had a thought, but like it was
no worries.
Like,
take your time.
There isn't really any, cause from like what you're saying, right? So how then do you know like if like so there isn't anything wrong in having a shadow self, like
there's nothing wrong. All of us have it, and all of us have it all the time. And I'm saying this because literally this afternoon, I got really irritated at my client. And then I was like, wait, I think this is with me. Because like every person who complains about their clients, I'm pretty sure a lot of you have done this, clients or colleague, every time you're irritated with them, Usually there's a very justifiable reason, and you can grab people and go like, yes, this person's wrong. There's always those kind of moments. You can do that. However, it's a different thing to go, wait. Why has it gotten to a level where it affects me? Where I'm not able to handle myself. This is due to a shadow self. Because I can be as anal retentive as this client for all the wrong reasons. I can be as that kind of person, and I don't like that person. And so when a person appears in front of me in that behavior, I cannot take it. The reason is because when I was younger, I got muted every single time I voiced out an opinion that was not relevant, because as a 3-year-old kid, what's the chances you know what's going on? But if it's irrelevant, I got muted. I would say that's I remember being waved off and saying that that's useless. Don't say that. That imprinted in me, where I started telling myself, I can only say what's important. I can only say what's useful. I'm not allowed to ask stupid questions. And that's what came out about. So what happened was that this became a trauma that I had to go, I literally meditated for 15 minutes just to be able to calm myself down, get to the place and observe it and just be with it. Then after that, I'm fine. Then it's all about solutioning after it. All right, how do I manage this? How do I deal with this? I mean, I'm still getting irritation bits in here, bits in there, bits and pieces here and there, but it's okay, because then it becomes I'm okay with my irritation because it is a part of me that I don't like, and I can admit to it first. Then I figure out what I'm going to do with it. Mm-hmm. Right? So there are certain traumas that and there are mechanisms that our head has concluded at a certain time during our experience from childhood, where we concluded that this is not allowed. These feelings, these patterns, this behavior, these thoughts, these feelings are not allowed. Therefore, I'll mute it and it becomes a shadow self.
So in a sense, if you do not know about traumas and you're acting in a way that is like, so for example, if let's say I were to if there's maybe a lesson plan, then I suddenly cry because of the topic. So in a sense, this is my unconscious self to lead me to cry. But if, maybe upon further evaluation, and maybe it could be a bad experience. So that's where the knowledge comes in.
Yes, that's when the knowledge comes in beautifully, and just the awareness helps you gain the next traction and the next step and the next step and the next step. The awareness of the shadow self is the first step to become a better person for yourself and become okay with things in a better and better ways. Absolutely right. So anybody here who doesn't know Johari window? Everybody knows a Johari window? Okay, cool. So actually, the interesting part about Johari window is I used to believe it was too simple and too duh. But actually, it's a very good way of consolidating whether you know your shadow self or not. It's a consolidation point. It's not a healing point. It's not a conversation point. It's not like the linchpin to solve all things. Because the more things we have in this area, the less we are affected by our shadow selves. Does this make sense? So the more things that are known to us and others, when we talk about this, is a lot of reasons why people get stuck with addiction. And one of the large parts of AA program, Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the major parts of the program is for people to find people to support them and speak openly about their issues. This is really important because speaking about it is a part of the process of you coming to terms with it. If you don't dare to talk about it, it means you haven't accepted it yourself. Right? So the part about no to others, again, it requires a safe space. We're okay. That's perfectly fine. You know, a lot of information shouldn't be in the wrong hands. But having a safe space is absolutely essential for people to move things from not known to others and not known to self, and eventually to known to self and known to others. If you look at your Johari window, and the thing is that it's completely unknown. Let's just put it this way. There's always going to be a bunch of stuff here that is completely unknown. The known to self area is exactly where you want to be for developing awareness for yourself. The known to others is when you can start realizing you have blind spots. For example, Jeffeth your kids will probably tell you you are a very angry person. And if you did not know from your wife that you are acting angrily, you would have not known at all. It would have been a huge blind spot. Right? Alex, when we were talking about control over godchildren.
Thanks.
Right? When we talk about parenting and we talk about taking care of other people and stepping boundaries and benevolent boundary violations, you would have not known it if not being highlighted by other people. Which is why, actually, once you look at shadow self, you recognize the need to be surrounded by good people. Because this is absolutely essential for you to know what is not known about yourself. People can tell you all the wrong things, right? There are people who tell you that you're not very charismatic, you're not very smart, you're not very whatever. Like, we always have parents who always play down our strengths. Not all of you lah. I know that my parents do. Everybody has parents who speak well of them all the time.
But it's okay. That's why we become strengths coaches, right? To help people discover their strengths.
Yes. So actually, this is one of the major things, right? Strengths coaching actually brings out a lot of the blind spots that you have that other people can recognize. Why do you do it in a group? Why do you do it with other people? Why do you find a strengths coach? Why are coaches so important? Coaches are very important that you can open up to be known.
Actually, for me, the part about control versus freedom, what's the definition of caring or loving someone and things like that. I realized a lot of times my blind spots were actually revealed when I had a reference of what is healthy.
Yeah.
So that's because I read a lot of Dr. Henry Clark at one period of time, right? I still do. When I was trying to getting to work through certain things about myself. And then he goes through this, okay, look, this is what a healthy relationship looks like. This is healthy expectations. This is what boundaries look like. This is not boundaries. The property line of your boundaries being you in control of yourself. And then also the responsibility that you take for your own feelings and not the, you make me angry. And then you then surrender your autonomy to the other person. So a lot of these things, simply because there has been described and listed somewhere that I can compare my own behaviors with, allowed me to recognize that, crap, there's a gap here that I need to deal with. And then work through them one by one.
Perfect. But just to let you know, right, there are a lot of people who I share this information, this type of information with, they completely do not see it even after 2 or 3 years. They will have a comparison point. Not everybody has the willingness for self-awareness. There's a willingness for self-awareness that is absolutely essential in this space. I've met many people, when you lay down what they have been doing, show it to them in the face and show them that, hey, look, there's an alternative here. Would you like to take this? The pain is too much for people to take it, that they'll run away and go to the opposite end. I don't know if you've seen this. In coaching circles, it's called rubber band effect. The person stretches, is able to get better, but then rubber band flies the other direction. There are certain people who go through that reaction because they have other underlying shadow self issues that is not being brought to surface. But you have to recognize, Alex, you are also the kind of person who likes to gain self-awareness. That is absolutely essential to identify shadow self. Because shadow self is all about lack of self-awareness. So yeah, if there's anything that today, if you want to remember about it, is any lack of self-awareness creates your shadow self that affects you in ways that you cannot understand or predict or even manage without gaining greater awareness. I'm just going to share with you guys this idea of this interesting thing called the Four Archetypes of Jungian ideas, right? There's this thing called the self. The real self on the inside. There's the shadow, which you don't want to see. There's the persona, which you bring to the world, which you are trying to bring to the world. Like, I am a successful this, I'm a this or that. How many of you know or are guilty of sometimes using your job title as your only form of identity? All right. So there are people who are like, I've worked with people who insist on getting a C-suite position in a startup. Why? You're running a startup, there's 3 people. Like, why do you need a C position, right? But it's down to their ego. It's the persona they want to go around saying, I am a C something. That's a persona they want to show the world. But remember, notice how the persona still leaves a shadow. Therefore, the shadow is always present. Then we talk about the anima or animus, which is a very interesting thing because Jungian concept came from Freudian concepts, and Freud talked a lot about sex. And then what this is what you think the other opposite gender will think of you. Or to be exact, is what you think other people will think of you, specifically in the sexual attraction zone, where what you think the other person will think of you. So if you think about pickup artists, they think of the way that women will think of these men in this certain manner. Therefore, they portray a certain anima. Like the anima creates a certain persona. Does it make sense? So this is also in the form of like how women view that they need to fit some certain traditional roles in order for them to attract the other party. Therefore, they stick by certain persona in front of the other gender. So this is a Jungian concept behind what he talks about. And then there's the self. This thing that, if you notice, is not colored, is hidden behind the pillar, is completely not visible. The real self is behind all of these things. It also includes all of these things, actually. So this is one of the good illustrations. If you want to remark more on this, very well, mine is very good for this. One of the major things about this is that the shadow self is always present whenever we bring a front to other people. For example, right now, as I'm presenting this person who's talking loudly, I have the soft-speaking person behind me, like in my shadow. It is not allowed at this moment. I mean, there's the positive version and negative version of this, right? There is the not allowed. I'm not allowed to be soft. Versus, I'm allowed to be soft. It's just not very useful for me right now. If not, I have to crank up my volume up so that you can hear me. If not, I can speak as loudly as this so that you can hear me clearly without having to bring up the mic. All these little things differs. Everything has its own shadows. The question is whether you're okay with it and whether you bring it to light such that it affects you in a negative way or it's just a part of you. That's what the shadow self is all about. So if you want to figure out what is your shadow self, this is where it gets fun. How many of you know ways of figuring out your shadow self? Just judging by what I just said and the usual ways you go about figuring out new things about yourself. How would you do that?
So for me, I typically start identifying triggers. So when I start to see that I'm starting to feel uncomfortable, I mean, sometimes it's non-rational, right? So, okay, so when I tend
usually
to have,
it's non-rational.
when I have irrational irritation, frustration, or anger, that's usually a sign that, that's a trigger. Then if I can, it's not always possible, I kind of go back and ask what I'm telling myself or what I'm picturing in my own head. And then I ask myself, is this fact or story? So if I can rewind this enough, sometimes it's enough to help me to get out and like, okay, look, this is a narrative I'm telling myself, get out of it. But I must say that even recognizing that it's a narrative I'm telling myself is not always easy to get out of it because that narrative seems so real. It's
but
like
it starts you on the journey.
Reality.
It starts you on the journey.
It does, but it can be a very frustrating one because you kind of see it, right? And there's this glass wall, and it's like, I think this is a glass wall, but damn, I can't get out of it. So it's the kind of feeling. But that's my journey of how I try to increase my awareness. And interestingly, because I kind of redid our Six Thinking Hat talent showcase recording, I found that the Six Thinking Hat is actually quite useful for that.
Yeah.
So for those of you who have attended the talent showcase, right? If not, go and watch the recording. So imagine, right, that I have this narrative in my head that may not be very useful. I start putting each of the 6 thinking hats to assess the story with each of these heads. And I've actually found that to be useful recently.
It creates empathy as well.
It creates empathy, but it also allows me to explore different perspectives and kind of shakes me out of my belief, right? Or my perspective. So I start looking at things like, okay, so what are the facts? Right. So what am I really feeling about it?
Yep.
What's the silver lining behind it? What are the possibilities and solutions?
So that's what we term as an amygdala hijack as well, somewhat, because once you jolt yourself out using a technique, that is almost like a hijack where your conscious mind uses a willpower to nudge it across, but also because you enjoy processes like this. If a person doesn't like to think in general, like they are too lazy to think and they feel like they're not thinking people, they wouldn't be able to use the 6 thinking heads to do that.
True. But then everybody needs a process by which they can get out of it, right? So it's kind of an interrupt, a process by which I kind of use. So I don't typically use 6 thinking heads. I brought it up because it's top of mind. I just looked at it and found it useful. But I find that the ability to just ask myself what my narrative is, and then identify whether it's fact, how much of it is fact and how much of it is story, actually helps me a lot.
And usually in your ratio, how much of it is just story?
A good portion of it. Because
usually in my world, right, it's a good 90%.
Yeah, it is. It's a good 90% that oftentimes once it's clarified. So the thing about, I think like you say, right, the thing about shadow self or the fears is that once it's shared in a open, accepting environment, it tends to dissipate. The only thing is because the narrative is often negative and scary, it often isn't shared.
Yes.
So that's the scary part, right? Yeah, then it cycles. But oftentimes if we go like, oh, actually, when I share it, then people are like, no, that's not the case. Then you go like, okay, silly me. Yeah, that kind of thing. And then it starts to dissipate. And then the next time it happens, you go like, it happened before, and I shared it, it was not. So maybe it's really not. And then the belief about, that cycle tends to shift, but it needs to first, a person needs to first be vulnerable to share what that narrative and story is.
Perfect.
So again, for those of you who have not read Brené Brown,
Brené Brown Vulnerability, yes, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me go around everybody to share a little bit more about how they do their own self-awareness. Even if it's similar to Alex, just share a bit about your way. So Irene Chi, if you can, because I need to separate between the two Irenes.
Don't know. Whilst I resonate with what you are saying on one hand, but I'm feeling the entanglement in my head. So it's quite difficult to. It's quite difficult. So like Alex just said, right? Okay, when your narrative or your story is negative, and then you don't tell people, and then it stays in your system, and it tends to repeat itself, right? But if you do find somebody you would share with, and hopefully it allows you to release it, but it may not dissipate totally. It may come back and haunt you again.
Yes.
Kind of, right? And so I'm just thinking it depends on how negative or how damaging that shadow self is.
Yes.
And how much it impacts that aspect of your life that is important to you.
It takes energy to gain that amount of awareness around it, right?
Yeah. So even though sometimes you may be aware when it happens, right? So now that you're talking about it, then I'm just trying to think, okay, what is my shadow self, right? What aspect of my shadow self that I would have experienced it? And it may not be immediately clear if what I'm thinking of a negative narrative is that shadow self.
So actually, all narratives are usually negative. All narratives are usually shadow self related in some aspects, because if it's a fixed narrative, means it cannot change and it cannot grow. It is absolutely a shadow self acting up. So that means if I cannot include another person's point of view, if I cannot do the 6 thinking caps heads point of view, if I cannot challenge this concept, it is a shadow self acting up.
Okay.
Like this person is just like this, right? And no matter how much you want to challenge it, you cannot change the belief. You cannot even hypothesize new ways of looking at it. That is actually an acting up of a shadow self, because you're suppressing your side while pushing it out towards the other person. So that's really where the fight is at.
So the interesting thing, therefore, in my head is that trying to recognize yourself. So like Jeppa said, he's actually angry, but he didn't know that he was angry, right? So I'm trying to follow his logic or explanation to try and understand where is that shadow self of me happening in me.
So like, for example, when you lose, when you're irritated with something and you get lost in a problem that is otherwise very small, or to you, right? Like initially it's a very small problem to you, but then for some reason you spend hours and hours thinking about it. Or like one of my favorite memes around this is there's this image done on Facebook that like there's this lady who talked about her ADHD, and then it's like a character goes like, I'm so unproductive. Then somebody goes, you should come, let's go be productive. He's like, no, I just, no productivity, only guilt. It's one of my favorite memes, because it's like, I feel unproductive, but I actually just want to feel unproductive. I don't want to be productive, right? When you can accept yourself saying that I just want to feel guilty, eventually it'll dissipate. But if you don't recognize it and you keep on saying that I need to be productive, and still cycle in that feeling while watching Netflix or doing other things, then it spirals out of control and hurts you. So productivity, like unproductive, is a part of me that I don't want to see, for example.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense in the example. So like I said, I'm following all the conversation that's going on, but I'm trying to reflect on my own. Yeah.
Okay, I have a few techniques I'm going to share afterwards that will also be helpful for everybody, because this is literally 16 years of my life's work. So I've done a lot of methodologies. I've worked with a lot of different people. I'm happy to share because it's actually all available online. It's just all over the place.
Okay, looking forward to that.
Cool. Faith?
Someone who do a lot of self-reflection. And I think during this period of time, I have the tendency to amplify negative thoughts. So I would think back and see, I'll try to see what are the good that I've done and what I have not. And try to find the trigger point. I'll think back until I try to think back every single step as far as I can.
That's cool.
Yeah, and when I couldn't figure it out, then that's when I'll bring my friend in to help explain what I think has happened and what do they see as an outsider on the situation. And that's how I would have more self-awareness on where I might have gone wrong. And because usually I confide in those that I'm closer with, so they would have known me for a period of time and they can give much constructive feedback on what is happening.
That's great. So you bring their awareness of you into the picture so they can give you a different perspective to help you understand more about what you are going through. Great way of looking at it. Okay, Paylin?
Actually, I have more of a question. Are all emotional triggers indicative that it's coming from the shadow self? Not necessarily, right?
Interestingly, right, emotional reactions are okay within themselves because it's an immediate reaction. It's instinctive. It is a heuristic that means I equate this with this. The shadow self, particularly, is when you suppress those emotions and it amplifies and it stays for a long period of time. So, for example, my client sends me something that irritates me. If I hold on to that feeling and start blaming him and start going down and around, that's shadow self acting up. If I get irritated and go, whoa, he's got his issues in place, but you know what? I need to do my part. And the emotions dissipate and it doesn't really stay. Then there's not shadow self acting up. But there's still a shadow self.
Yeah, it's just that you sort of nip it in the bud with some processing, whatever system that you have in place.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So for me, I think self-awareness is really doing a lot of self-reflection, especially during times when I feel that I am a little bit different from my usual self, because I'm considered emotionally quite stable, but I'm not totally immune to negative emotions. So I resonated with what Jeffrey mentioned. So I went through a stage whereby feeling any negative emotions is not a good thing. Like I feel I shouldn't. Type 9, yes. I think also because I'm so tied to my own image of being positive, I do not like to share any negative emotions to my friends. Only my very close ones I'll share my negative emotions. So I'm so tied to that particular self-image that I think I cannot be angry, even though like Jeff, I'm like seething inside. Or by the way, type 9, we take very long to respond emotionally. Something can happen like today, and then we can sometimes feel it only the next day. Yeah, by then the war is over. So that's us. I don't know about Jeffer. Maybe that's just me.
Jeffer seems to be nodding away. So I'm glad, because these are like awareness, right? Like notice how once we talk about type 9, there's a lot of awareness of the tendencies of the behaviors. And then she also related back to your positivity, right? Which is number 1 on your strengths, right? So that's also bringing to do more in details, right? So
exactly,
that's exactly it. I'm going to skip from Jeffers right now to go to Joanna first.
I think for me it's also quite similar. Like it will be self-reflection, and then usually I will just like question myself, like does this reaction make sense? Like, what am I not considering? Maybe the other person was doing something else, or that kind of thing. Then sometimes if it's like I just really have like a strong reaction, I might just be like talking to my boyfriend, then he will be able to like have a different perspective.
Oh, that's very cool. So he often helps you be the counterbalance to help you recognize what you're thinking.
Yeah, like, I think he will provide me like alternative perspectives. Like he might not be able to say like, or maybe you are thinking of this or that, but like from the alternative perspective that he gives me, then I have something more to reflect on.
So like I'll use Alex's point just now, right? Reference points, like other reference points to look at it in a different way of looking at things, so that you can think of it in a different manner. Very cool. Right, Lillian?
I think for me it's slightly different. So I think, like, because it talks about self-awareness, right? So I think I won't really be aware about certain things unless like I'm uncomfortable or unless people tell me about it. So I think for me it's to come out of my comfort zone. Yeah, and to do something. Because I realized over like the past few years, it's like all my blind spots were when I had to step out of my comfort zone. And then that's when like things happened, and then like my shadow self started to show up, and I was like very confused. Then after that, like people tell me, oh, you know, you're doing this. Then after that, I start to reflect, and then I was like, oh, okay. Then like I had to learn how to do something about it. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, very cool. So it's about stepping out of your comfort zone. That's something that's very interesting that I will share with that later on as well. So Eileen T. So I don't know your last name, but
it's Lintan.
Okay.
I think in terms of self-awareness, if it's somebody that I'm not so close with, for example, colleagues, right? So in meetings, for example, I think the self-awareness is quite high. So I could like feel my blood boiling, then voice escalating, which is out of the norm. Typically, I'm quite calm and cool. So and usually I will verify it after the meeting or call with a colleague.
Oh, okay.
So I will like, am I shouting too loud? Sorry, yeah. So I'm like, am I speaking too loud? Am I raising my voice, or did I control myself? And after that, there will be some level of self-justification. Like, this person is really annoying, right? Did I recognize it wrong or something like that? So that self-awareness level and getting feedback is much stronger to people that not close with. But I think the shadow self comes out more frequently with people that you are close with, unfortunately. So
yes,
the outbursts just come fast and quick, and by the time it's done, when you realize it's almost gone, and that is more of the reflection and get coming.
Like family, right?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. Because we usually believe that they will always be there and they'll be more forgiving. So
possibly.
yeah. So these are actually part of shadow self as well, by the way. Actually, a lot of us bring our shadow selves to our families without knowing it too. So that's a great point by Irene, which is perfect, right? Like it's something that a lot of us, actually, if you ask our family members, they might give us a very different account from what our friends would say of us. Because they might see the shadow side. But the interesting part about this is that neither side are wrong. Both are true. That means who you present yourself to your family very often is also who you are. It's just that it was either hidden. Again, we go back to Johari window, right? I'm just going to share again. Because it will be not known to your friends, but will be known to your family. Or sometimes not known to yourself and therefore known to your family. Or it's known to you and not known to your friends, so that you will always hide that part of yourself and you put a facade as to presenting a different front in front of them. A lot of us do that, whether or not we want to. So this goes back to, if you go back to the Jungian concept, right, of the persona, we have multiple persona to deal with different people and hide different shadow selves behind them. And this is a very common behavior, which is okay. Everybody does it. I just prefer to have one integrated personality for myself, as close as myself as I can get at all times if I can. And that's where the self-awareness comes in. Because the greater my self-awareness, I know when I'm acting out from my shadow self and managing it in a manner that still helps me become the person I want to be, while still having the kind of conversations I want to have and still being natural and present with people. Alex, you want to share something?
No, I have a question. So actually, throughout the conversation, we talked quite a little bit about anger. We talked quite a bit about repression and expression. So a couple of things in my head, right? If shadow self happens when we repress a certain emotion or certain aspects that comes out instead of expressing it, then my first question is, what then is the difference between repression and self-control? Because in office context, you can't just bra, right?
Most people think they're the same thing. They're actually very, very different things. I'm going to talk about this just a bit later. Great question. It's related back to the other thing that I'm going to talk about for the techniques of gaining self-awareness.
Okay. Because I think that's an important distinction, right?
Yes.
The repression and the self-control when something
absolutely happens. These are very important things that, like, I learned through the years through weirdly time management books, creativity books, and other things that actually helped me a lot. So there are a lot of techniques that are actually hidden in a lot of secret places all around the net. There's nothing to do with personal development. Has to do with practical real world skill set related stuff that actually became very useful for me once I utilized it in other areas. So these are things that, like, I'll share with you guys some of the basic stuff. I think we need another session to talk about the real tools that I can go on forever about. But today I at least can give people a little bit more depth as to how to gain self-awareness first. Because after that, then is where the real work begins. If you can have Irene share a bit more about how she increases her self-awareness.
I think the way I define shadow is the part where it is the hardest to let go. And the yardstick with which most people measure, meaning using that on family, is quite contrary to me. I don't do that to my family. They're too precious for me to lash out at them like that. So it is fairly unusual then to have to figure out what is the thing that not just the trigger, the thing that stays with you and hardest to dissipate, I think. And I think with the years of wanting to grow and to develop, and that kind of have a very heavy overlay, as a result, it is quite difficult to figure out which is the worst shadow. There are many shadows, right?
Yes. I'm not saying the worst, but like, how do you gain self-awareness, right? Like, so it's like even the simpler stuff, even the irritation towards yourself when you do the wrong thing, or how do you gain self-awareness from these processes, like yourself? How do you increase your self-awareness? Because you're saying, right, you don't really do it to your family, and you have this thing where you say age allows you to be more safe with yourself. I think that's very, very cool. And then what else, like, how do you gain more awareness of different parts of you and how it comes out?
Just sit with yourself.
Okay, very
just
cool.
Be still with yourself.
All right, very cool. Okay. Cher, what about yourself?
So I can totally relate with what Aileen was saying about positivity. Like it's been difficult for me to recognize negative emotions, and the pandemic was definitely one of those, oh, you need to recognize. And I struggled with being okay with having negative emotions. And one of the most recent things that's been very helpful for me is having a coach. Like they ask me the questions, I'm like, oh, I wasn't prepared to answer that. But it gets me thinking, and it's making me reveal more and actually really talk it through with somebody. And that's been super helpful.
Very cool. That's very helpful to share. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. First up, I would be very open to say that I basically have a lot of peer coaching happening with people like Alex and Jeffers and this kind of stuff. I also have a therapist that I regularly meet because, especially last year when I was going through my really tough times where I can obviously say this, I recently got annulled due to marriage issues. Personally, I had to go through a lot of rejigging of my own way of looking at things. Got a therapist. Even though he said I was discharged effectively, I said, you know what? I just want to work on things a lot more now. So I started working with him a lot on the therapy grounds and even discovering new things about myself regularly. So I use a lot of tools and a lot of ways personally to try to increase self-awareness, because one of the things that Alex said all the way back is having a reference point. One of the biggest struggles I've noticed most of my peers, most of my friends have, is they struggle to find good reference points as to what is possible, what does it mean to be healthier, what are the new possibilities I can have, and things like that. That's why having coaches, therapists, and all these kind of different things are helpful. However, there are also a lot of things we can do on our own that increases this. Let me start with the first thing that I like to do a lot of, which is, I call it rent. One of the important things about renting, which is the rent and rave, like just keep talking, right? So anybody knows about this app called Otter.ai? Yeah, I shared with Jeffers and Alex. So Otter.ai is a live transcribing tool that is one of the best so far in terms of transcribing a voice into text. So I will literally rent into Otter.ai and then read it afterwards and see how ridiculous I was. Right? One of the major things about this is observing your ridiculous self, the part of you that you don't want to see, and letting it out full-blown into a phone. It's one of the most useful ways I found to find out what my darker self are, right? I can describe how I would slice a person up, literally. Because I'm trained medically, so I know all the best places to slice. But that doesn't mean I'll do it. But having the safe space of just an app to speak that into helps me rechannel my anger and just observe why I was saying this, what I was looking for, what is happening in my mind. Your renter, great. Let me just put this into the group chat, Otter.ai. They have 600 minutes free for a free account. As long as you can download on any apps and you can just keep recording and just speak right into it. You can just rent into it, right? And then it saves it as meeting. Yes, these are little things that I find very useful. Another thing that I like to do, I used to do, is write, especially when I don't want to speak or I cannot speak. I write for 3 pages nonstop on my notebook. So my pen does not leave the paper. Just keep writing every single negative thought and bad thought and good thought and every random thought onto the paper. 3 pages nonstop. If I can write more, but at least 3 pages. Why is this important? It's because it pours out all your thoughts. Alex, you want to share something or ask?
I just wanted to say that if you don't want to use Otter AI, Zoom actually has a live transcript now. You can actually use that. Just get on Zoom, turn on live transcript. It transcribes everything you say.
That's great too. I didn't know that. Okay. Yeah. Pei-Lin, you want to share?
Oh, I wanted to ask you whether you tested between writing and typing out. Like, is there a difference for you?
I'm an oral person. So I'm an oral person. Like, I'm all ears. So for me, saying is a lot more powerful. So I used to have people who are my renting boards, my friends, who are literally just sit there, don't say anything, it's okay. Let me just speak. And I just go at them. And what happens is that for a lot of my friends, they find it entertaining. So it's great. So so it used to be that, and the best part about it is because usually I watch myself as a rent. So I'm actually an unconscious renter. So I don't think about a rent. I watch myself as a rent. And then I start like drawing it out on a board, or I start doing things. That helps me kind of consolidate what I'm feeling and doing and seeing from the situation. It helps a lot. The writing part is very good for people who love like visual, literature level kind of stuff, right? I have friends who love journaling, like they would love to just sit down and think about their words, come up with the words and just roll it all out. They feel better with that, so it is a better process for them. And then the other part about this is that they don't need to worry about other people hearing them. So for example, if I'm in my own room, I get to rant and rave and whatever. When I'm in office, I can rant and rave because I'm usually alone. But if I'm with other people, if I'm living in a house with other people, I cannot do that, right? So this is why the journaling is also a very useful tool. So then you can write. Yes. Faith, thanks for sharing that. So Faith said, yeah, you can start writing the surface thoughts and notice how it suddenly changes to your inner thoughts on some things that have been affecting you subconsciously. It's quite amazing. At least try for 10 minutes. This all helps a lot. Irene, I believe you talked about sitting with yourself. How many of you cannot be bored? Like you will be bored very easily if you just sit down and don't do anything. Yeah, Faith. Okay, so, Jeffers uses empty chair technique. What's that?
So I think it's building on Cher's point, right? Like Cher gets a coach, and I mean many times when we get the shadow selves because we already dissociate it, right? So it became from a first person where I accepted it as part of me. Now it became a thing out there
outside of me.
Outside of me. So what I usually do is I reintegrate it back to me by first identify what is that frustration, what's that irritation. Then I talk to it in second person. Then I ask like, what are you actually? Who are you? Why are you here? I'll ask these kind of questions. Then I'll hear what answer they give back to me until I reach a point where I can find that, oh, this is me, and I feel that I'm feeling that anger, and the anger is part of me.
You're describing perfectly what I define as an analytical portion of what I do when I rant. So because what you're doing is, after this personality is out, I can ask it questions. I can observe my tendencies. I can observe from another perspective. Now that my rant is out, I can take on myself.
Yeah.
To talk to it, right? So beautiful way of looking at it. So that's another technique that would integrate both parts. But usually, unless you're trained, it's hard to talk to yourself unless you effectively dissociate fully. So dissociation is the term where you are not, okay, so by right, dissociation is termed as you are not in your body, where you are not yourself anymore, right? So this is where actually, Jeffers, my definition may be different from yours because again, classic psychology terms, I would project, I would transfer the personality outside onto an empty chair. Those are the terms I'll use. Transfer or project onto an empty chair and then talk to that person as a separate person.
Yes. So that's like a second person, right? You project to another entity to talk to. Yeah.
Yep. That can look like you, that can not look like you, or different things. Tony Robbins does this during sessions where he helps a person identify the names of the different person. Like there's the good Jeffers and the angry Jeffers and the kind Jeffers and everything, and then he will just help people do that as well. Alex?
That sounds like a stock therapy.
It is a lot like a stock.
Okay.
I mean, it's ultimately to get a different perspective, right? Then, and sometimes you don't know what will come out of it. And I think if you have a coach, I would have utilized a coach because the coach would shoot me different directions to expand that perspective and unpack it. Yeah.
That I would term as self-coaching even.
Yeah.
So what he talks about, I would even define it as self-coaching or self-therapy. So I do a lot of that myself when I meditate. So lately I do a lot of sitting down and just sitting with my thoughts, right? So Irene, can you share a bit more about sitting with your thoughts?
Just meditate over who you are, what created that, how did it impact you. I mean, just sitting still and just ponder.
What would you say to a person who has a lot of difficulty sitting still?
I mean, I am a person who's very scared of boredom. But when I'm sitting still to think, I have a lot of things to do, I'm not bored.
Okay, so the beautiful thing that you just described, right, is the reason why, okay, so a lot of people who I know who are bored, who feel bored, don't want to sit with their thoughts. Boredom is usually the excuse of avoiding your internal thoughts, because that's when your shadow self will appear. And it will show itself to you and go, hello, can you see me? And start talking to you. That's usually what happens. So a lot of people who say they cannot meditate or cannot sit with themselves usually are like that. So it's not that, Irene, you don't sound like a person who's afraid of boredom. You're a person who actually, because boredom doesn't exist for you because you recognize your internal thoughts. Is that the case?
Well, engaged. I have to be engaged. It is an intention to engage with myself. It is an activity.
Great.
So the intention has to be there.
Okay, so if anybody has been to a lecture where you're bored by the lecturer, right, it's usually probably because you're not engaging with probably the side of yourself that's probably angry with the lecturer for being useless and boring, or who's judging yourself for not being able to understand. So very often boredom during a lecture or a session or anything is also because you're probably judging yourself for that. If not, you just drop out, focus on other things, or just tell straight out to the person, hey, why are you like this? Ideally, those are the so-called healthy responses rather than over there feeling bored. So there are a lot of ways of looking at this, right? The healthiest forms of managing bad lectures or bad teaching, or if you're bored by the way I'm talking to you now, should be just, hey, Ethan, I think you're kind of missing the point. Can you go back to this? That is so-called healthy, right? If you're able to do it in a polite, loving way, that is so-called the ideal healthy self. Most of us are trained to be silent and still even when the lecture is boring. And when we talk about boring, it's because you're supposed to suppress yourself to listen to the lecture so that you can get the information you're supposed to get. That's not the case. That's not a healthy space. A lot of spaces in this world are all about suppressing yourself so that somebody can have their space to be themselves or to present themselves in a certain way. So that's where power dynamics appears in the picture. That's what actually the reason why I started the Office Matters, right? Like to talk about politics in that manner, where you're not allowed to be yourself, but somebody else is, right? So that's why we feel bored. For example, a boyfriend who goes with his girlfriend to go shopping, but then he's not allowed to look at what he wants to look at, and he has to stay right next to her, feels bored. He's suppressing himself. He's not sitting with his feelings, his thoughts, his unhappiness. He has to stay with his girlfriend, right? Or the other way around, right? Where a girlfriend follows a boyfriend to the places that he goes, but then she's bored, right? Why? Because she's suppressing herself. Boredom is a reaction to suppression of self. And it's very often a distraction. So with this, I want to wrap up this overall thing. Now that we know how to gain self-awareness, at least in 3 major techniques that we have been talking about right now, right? Which is, one is to speak to author.ai, transcribe, read it yourself afterwards. Second one is write on a journal, write nonstop, express yourself. Actually, Irene added on, the other one is sit with yourself, just go through the thoughts yourself. But another way of doing that is with Jeffers' empty chair technique, which is to speak to yourself in a projected manner. So these are very, very good ways of actually understanding and connecting with your shadow self so that you can understand it just a little bit more today. There are other techniques. Alex, you were talking about self-control versus
repression.
Suppression or repression, right?
Yep.
So one of the major techniques that I've learned from a creativity book, and this is not talked about actually in any text I've gotten, and I promise people I'll write a Medium article on it, still haven't written, sorry. I call it emotional displacement, but in a timeline framework. I can don't displace it to another person or another thing. I can displace it to another time. Means, hey, anger, I hear you. I'm going to deal with you after work. And then you must abide by it and actually deal with anger and talk to it in the empty chair technique or rant or all these different techniques. You don't have to do it at the moment things happen. If you need to calm yourself down in the middle of a situation, when your shadow self is about to jump out and just lunge at the person's throat, you need support in this manner of recognizing, hey, I'm getting really angry. I'm going to work on you at another time. I have a dedicated time where I can sit with you and understand you and get to a better place. That allows me to manage my emotions. So that's control. Control is not control. You can't control a river. You can redirect it. You can re-divert it by digging new tunnels and everything, but you can't push it up the water, right? You can't push it back up. You can't suppress it. It's about rediverting it to another time, another space, respecting and honoring it so that you can understand and communicate with it in a safe space. And that's really what I will share for today. There's a lot more techniques that I would love to share with you guys in the future about like identifying certain traumas. There's so many different interesting dissociative techniques, hypnotic techniques, all these kind of different things. But you know, that will be for another time because we're at 9:30 already. Oh no. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Alex to help me wrap up before I do a summary.
Huh? That doesn't make sense. Isn't the wrap up the summary?
You wrap up with the different people and the takeaways.
Oh, that wrap up. Okay. I was still busy on my mirror. So usually what we do at the end of the session is to share what your biggest takeaway from the session is. So let's just go one quick round, doesn't have to be long. What your personal takeaway was from today's discussion. And let's start with Faith.
The Johari window is a good reminder to us to know that there are always things that we are hidden in a blind spot, and to really have the knowing our own level of lack of self-awareness or awareness, and finding the correct manner to help you to move out of your shadow self, to let it turn into a strength rather than something that affects your friendship or relationship with others. The techniques that Ethan mentioned about using the audio, that's quite interesting also, especially. Yeah, because sometimes there's a different feel when you write versus you talk. Yeah. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Faith. Paylin.
I was thinking about self-acceptance. I think for us to feel accepted in the group, in the workplace, with our friends, to even feel that we are accepted, we have to work on our self-acceptance. But if we don't integrate our shadow self, that means if we keep it dissociated, right? I think it's very hard to reach self-acceptance. So working on our shadow self and integrating it and accepting it, it's quite important inner work that we need to do to achieve self-acceptance.
Awesome. Thanks, Paylin. Eileen Chi.
I think overall it's an interesting awareness of this whole concept of the shadow self. So lots of food for thought.
Okay, and anything specific that was fruitful?
I don't know. Like I said, it's just so many things muddle up. So I will check out some of the websites that Ethan shared. As he was talking, I was Googling some of the sites. So yeah, things to read up on.
Awesome. Thanks, Eileen. Joanna?
I think for me it was about knowing that like all these emotional reactions or like feeling irrationally annoyed about something has its roots in the shadow self.
Lillian?
I think for me would be to like how negative feelings are okay, because I think I relate a lot like do this session whereby like I will try to suppress all these like feelings and then or like it's not alright to cry or it's not alright to feel this way. But I think through this session I understand that like having a shadow self is normal, and like certain situation can lead to it, and sometimes we do not have a say or control over those situations, but it's more of like how we deal with it, but like acknowledging it and then to deal with it. So I think it's good to know that like I'm not the only one struggling with all this kind of like shit that happens in life. Yeah.
So sometimes the best takeaway we can have is you're not alone. Right. Thanks, Leon. Irene?
I'm just enjoying a type 7 in action. Very animated, full of life, very energetic. I just have to go back and dwell a bit more on this part about boredom being a form of suppression to self. I am still thinking about that.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Irene. Eileen, is it? E.T.?
Yep. I think one big takeaway is having a definition to something that you're not used to or comfortable feeling.
I think the audio's kind of freaking up.
Goes to shadow self. And then last one, I will control. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you're
broke
back.
up for a bit. It broke up for a bit. Yeah, you can turn on the video to talk.
Okay, which one do you miss? Everything.
The whole thing. Sorry.
Okay. I just quickly repeat. The interesting part is about now there's a definition of something that I'm not comfortable with, which is shadow self. And what I like is really the last part about how to deal with it. So a lot of times, like I mentioned, meetings, right? We cannot just deal with it now, then and then. So it's more like, okay, I'll deal with you later. Just let me control myself at this moment. So I think that is the biggest takeaway from me.
Okay, thanks, Celine. And sure.
Just the concept of the shadow self, I think, is something I want to learn more about. But I love Ethan's tip about venting to self and putting it in writing and then reading back. I think that would be very revealing, and I've downloaded the app already.
Awesome.
Thanks. You,
Cher. Jeffers?
Learned quite a fair bit. Just like the more perspective on what shadow self is. Ethan sharing right from where the roots came from, and just appreciate the fact that everybody is facing it differently, so we're all like living in separate realities, but we all acknowledge that everybody is in some way has experienced it, just in different ways, right? And that's just being human.
Okay, so Ethan, I will try to share my takeaway and my wonderful mural board that I've been so busily typing just now.
Thank you for helping us to do this. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I will try to summarize it. This is what it looks like in terms of what we spoke today. So we kind of started off with identity, right? That there's ideal self, the ego. I lumped it with perceived self, and of course there's a whole shadow self. And our shadow self, actually, there's this huge loop, right? Actually, it manifests a lot in terms of the what's not allowed, what we don't give ourselves permission for. It actually comes from being imprinted when we are younger, and it comes from that, and actually comes from our parents, right? I think Irene also talked about how the Enneagram shows the type that we are most trapped in most, and also how it's the hardest to let go. Right? When we talk about shadow self, we kind of describe what it was. Basically, parts that we don't like about self, largely unconscious, disassociated, and points of our irritation and suppress, and sometimes can appear as addictions or quarrels with other people. Well, it tends to remain as a shadow self as long as we remain judging it, and we find that acceptance is important. And I like what Paylin said, right? That acceptance from other people, I think the self-acceptance part is actually very important. And the part of acceptance is unconditional, therefore safe space, right? So the big question is, do we have a safe space where we can be ourselves? I kind of added the grace part, right, for me, because a lot of the unconditional acceptance is part of the concept of grace.
Yep.
So we look at how self-awareness is actually a very, very big part of uncovering and dealing with our shadow self. So we talked about what some tools are. Essentially, one of it is reflection, whereby we identify what our narrative is, because there's a trigger and an irrational response. separating it between fact and story, and talking about 6 thinking hats. We did talk about having different reference points for which we can reflect upon our narrative and our behaviors. Vulnerability is a big part of self-awareness. The ability to share with others what our internal narrative is tends to shed light and kind of demolish it as well. The other part about self-awareness is about getting feedback. Some of us get it from family, some of us get it from coaches, and it actually gives us a reference points to feedback to our narratives again, right? So it kind of links back. And there's a whole big part that Ethan shared about the techniques that we have. The big point is basically to rant and rave. All of us rant and rave differently. Some of us sit in our thoughts. Some use author, talk to ourselves. Some use the empty chair. Empty chair to me is very much about going to the second and third perceptual position, right? So that's one way to do it. And regardless of how you rave and rant and record it, it's always interesting to go and observe your ridiculous self at some point of time and see what that looks like, and allow that to shed light onto your shadow self. And the last one I put together was actually, if boredom oftentimes is the result of suppression of self. I also read it somewhere else that a lot of times we do things to distract ourselves because we are not willing to sit alone with our own thoughts. So that's actually a quite interesting thing to explore in terms of what thoughts surface when we are by ourselves. So that kind of summarizes our speech. My biggest takeaway really is about how different people deal with the shadow self and how we could work on it. There's this little part here about anger. I'm going to just summarize it in general that emotions are okay. We need to accept ourselves for whatever emotions come out and not repress or judge ourselves for it. And then we can process and metabolize it. So
there's a request for you to send this into the into probably the Telegram or the group so that people can have this.
Okay, it's very messy. I'll just send it as it is, yeah?
Yeah, send it as it is. I think people are okay as long as they watch the video.
Okay. Yep. Okay, cool. So that's my summary.
Very great summary. Thank you, Alex. I'll just like to add in, right, to wrap it up nicely. I think thanks, Alex. It seems like our strategy is starting to work, and our discussion that day has starting to turn up for something useful. Because we just had an internal brainstorming session
using human-centered design.
Yeah, great sum up. I loved it. I think the other. Let me just wrap it up with this, right, where the talk about shadow self, and the reason why we even did this thing is because Jeffert was reading up on it and we wanted to talk about it. My love for the shadow self is really because of the fact that so again, my background, people who don't know, I'm actually Aspergic, but very mildly so, but I didn't know. So what happens throughout my upbringing, I was struggling to interact with people. So a lot of these things has to do also with the shadow self related stuff. But a lot of my learning and breaking away from it, right, came a lot on the grounds of acceptance of all the darkest parts of me. The parts of me that people don't want to see. The parts of me that, so like the way I used to take feedback was to challenge, because what throughout my upbringing, right, like my family always challenged one another whenever there was feedback. But my automatic reaction was to challenge, not negatively, but just to really understand. But if you know Asian culture, once you challenge somebody of higher authority, what does that mean? You get things really bad from them. So that's what I was brought up with a lot of, and I learned to challenge in other ways. One of the biggest things I've learned, your gauge of your shadow self, and this is a nice way to wrap it all up, right? One of the best ways of gauging your shadow self is how well you take to the different challenges that comes your way. When we talk about this is, if somebody gives you a feedback that you're wrong or you're bad, how you take it tells you how powerful your shadow self is in managing this kind of situations and how accepted is it. For example, even if somebody is saying the wrong thing about me or maligns me for something, if my shadow self is well in place and well accepted and integrated, I can react as like, what? And then wait, what was that about? Like, why would you say that about me? I will inquire and try to figure out more. But what most people with a strong shadow self that can act up and can act out towards the other person would be to immediately react and defend and start fighting no matter what the situation is. So a lot of the times it's about the challenges and the things that we go out and we fail in, or we get bad feedback on, or whatever, that gives us the greatest gauge of our self-awareness and how well you understand our shadow self. And with that, I just like to wrap this up as a way of like, now you have the tools of at least gaining even more awareness. Hopefully we can cover more about how do you analyze how the shadow self works. Next round.
I have a question. How am I going to get the board to you?
Just download as PDF.
Hey, I'm going to post it on Facebook.
Yeah, under the comments.
Yeah,
Can
I'll
you
just
post
post it on
into
Facebook.
Telegram? I don't think I follow in Facebook.
Both.
Okay,
Check out-
can. I'll do that.
Yeah.
I'll post it on Telegram. Cool.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everybody.
Hey, thanks everyone for joining us. I'll send it to you all.
Thank you.
Okay,
night.
thanks.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you.
See you
Good
all.
night. See you.
Bye.
Bye.